One of Trump's attorneys from his first impeachment hearing is Robert Ray. We've got Bob Ray. We also have former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. So we heard the argument laid out. Gentlemen, both of you, Happy New Year, and thank you for being here. Renato, if you don't impeach and remove, as the Constitution prescribes for a president, is he immune from anything that happened in office?
Obviously not. He's obviously not immune. And I think you don't need to be a lawyer to understand that. The judge was asking incredulously a moment ago, because on its face, it's absurd. I mean, if, for example, a president did try to assassinate his political rival and said the Senate wanted to impeach and remove him, he could just murder all the senators. And presumably that would have no recourse, right? According to this theory of how the Constitution is supposed to work. I think on its face, it's laughable. And it's actually not in accordance with the text of the Constitution. If you look at the impeachment clause, and I'm sure Mr. Ray will do that in a moment, I think if you took all the politics out of it and had a bunch of people just look at the plain language of it, I think it's fairly clear that the framers of the Constitution did not intend for that absurd result to occur.
We'll put it up for everybody, and you and Bob Ray agree. This reeks of politics, but Robert Ray sees it breaking a different way. And just what you see highlighted on the screen here before I give it to Counselor Ray, the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. The argument is, what if he's not convicted? So if he's convicted, then sure, then you can also be prosecuted once you're thrown out of office. But what if you're not convicted in the political process? Bob Ray, to you.
In other words, if you looked at the Constitution, it doesn't say, which is, I think, the argument in favor of, this is a laughable argument, which I don't think it is. The Constitution doesn't say whether convicted or not, the party remains liable and subject to criminal prosecution, indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment, which you would think, if that's what the framers intended, it would say. I have to confess, I never really thought about this when I was independent counsel trying to decide whether, after Bill Clinton left office, he could be prosecuted for obstruction of justice and perjury.
Because you sounded more like Renato then, Bob.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I guess my takeaway is that I don't think I ever really thought about it because, I think everybody agreed that Bill Clinton's conduct, while reprehensible, didn't constitute official action in the way that we think about it now when we're talking about President Trump and other potential hypotheticals that were raised today before the three-judge panel. Also, I certainly, this was addressed at oral argument. What do you do about the case of Richard Nixon? And Richard Nixon's case was, he was obviously impeached by the House, but before there was a Senate trial and before the Senate actually took action to remove him and convict him from office, he resigned. I suspect
that... Well, he was pardoned.
Well, he resigned and then later was pardoned.
The deal.
And the argument
But that seals the deal.
Well, I'm not sure it does. The argument is that why would there have been a need to pardon him if he wasn't otherwise subject to prosecution thereafter? And I think the answer is the resignation probably, at least in my view, would constitute a waiver of that immunity. In other words, he would have been subject to prosecution after he resigned.
But the resignation itself, though, is not a constitutionally operative nor legally operative concept. It's a political dynamic of him stepping away. And to Bob's point, Renato, if the pardon wasn't necessary, why did he pardon him? Ford pardoned Nixon so that he wouldn't be prosecuted. Meaning the expectation was, even though he had not been convicted in the Senate, he would have gotten jammed up as soon as Ford took office. So what does that mean here?
Well, what it means, Chris, is that until this very creative argument had been come up with this week, everyone presumed that a president could be prosecuted. That's why Mr. Ray this thought never occurred to him before. It's why, for example, the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, on the floor of the Senate when he said that he was voting not to remove Donald Trump, said that that's because the legal system could deal with it and there could be a criminal trial later. Everyone thought that that was the case. And this is the sort of thing, from my perspective, that gives lawyers a bad name. Understandably, we can come up with clever arguments, but it's the sort of thing that's more of a lawyer's trick to me than a serious argument.
Well, I don't
also,
agree with that. I don't
due
think
respect,
that's right.
just to clarify the McConnell point, and then I'll give it to you,
Sure.
Bob. All due respect to McConnell, and I wish him well. That's a clever dude right there. And we saw that what he did with Merrick Garland, McConnell has no problem making an argument that serves him in the moment and then just reversing it like he did with Merrick Garland. He could have been doing the same thing here. Oh, yeah, they'll take care of him afterwards. We don't have to vote him out right now. But if you reverse the R and the D, he may have made the opposite case. So, Bob, let me ask you this, and you take it wherever you want.
Sure.
Do you believe that this goes to the Supreme Court if it goes against Trump? Is this a case that they would take, you think?
I do, because I don't think the answer is obvious from the Constitution. I mean, I think the D.C. Circuit is going to weigh in here. I would suggest to everyone that they pay attention to what Judge Henderson decides to do. I think I can fairly well predict what the other two judges on the D.C. Circuit are likely to rule. But I think whatever happens and however they come out, there may be a short stop to sort of allow the D.C. Circuit time to decide whether it wants to consider this en banc, which is the full court, the full complement of judges before the D.C. Circuit, which President Trump, if he loses, has the right to request. I imagine that the D.C. Circuit will skip right over that, and this will then be ripe for a petition for certiorari to be filed. And I imagine the Supreme Court is going to have to grant this one, too, because, again, we're in uncharted territory. This has not come up before. Just to give you an example, during the first impeachment, where I represented President Trump, I never thought about this issue in that context either, partly there because our position was that President Trump hadn't been charged with a crime. So immunity really wasn't the issue. Our defense of him was that impeachment wasn't proper because he hadn't been charged with a high crime or misdemeanor. They were attempting to convict him and remove him from office. And our further argument was, there's an election upcoming. Let the people decide what to do about this. This is not an appropriate situation for him to be removed from office. And then finally, I would say to take the immediate, history out of this. Think about how this would apply in George Washington's time. Imagine George Washington serves his time in office, and there's a whiskey rebellion, as there was. And this was one of the only times that the President of the United States actually took the field as the commander-in-chief to suppress a rebellion. Fortunately, it was suppressed peacefully. But it certainly could have come out another way. Do you think that President Washington would have signed on to a constitution that would have allowed him to be subject to prosecution absent impeachment once he left office, that somebody's going to haul him out of Mount Vernon and put him in the dock because he fired upon people during the Whiskey Rebellion in order to suppress a rebellion from people who probably quite rightly believe, wait a minute, we escaped taxation from the king, and now you want to tax the whiskey here in the United States under the new government. We're not going to put up with this. Okay. Wiser heads prevailed. Renato, Washington was able to solve that problem, but nobody ever thought that George Washington was going to be put in the dock and hauled out of Mount Vernon after he left office to be prosecuted.
That's because it wasn't a self-serving situation where he tried to subordinate the Constitution to his own interests. This was an attack against the U.S. government, rightful or wrongful, that he wound up getting involved in.
But listen carefully to what President Trump said today. What he said he was doing was he had the right to defend the integrity of elections. You may think that he's wrong about that, and a lot of what I've heard
No, I don't think he's wrong about that.
Under the rug the notion.
I don't think he's wrong about that.
Well,
Bob, I don't think he's wrong about saying that he has a right and, in fact, a duty to protect elections. I'm saying that the case against him is that that's not what he was doing. Well, he was trying to destroy the integrity of the election for his own benefit. But let me give the last word to Renato before I'm out of time.
Hey, Chris, but immunity means you have the right to be wrong in that regard.
All the arguments that Mr. Ray is making are factual arguments that presume that the allegations in the indictment aren't true. Unfortunately for Mr. Ray and for President Trump, at this stage, the judges have to presume that the allegations in the indictment are true, which is, among other things, that none of this was an official act by the president. And that actually was an argument that was made today. So just to be crystal clear, I think Mr. Wray's arguments are very interesting and they can occur at a criminal trial. They have no place in this appeal. And I will actually predict the United States Supreme Court is not going to take this because you're not going to have a majority of the Supreme Court signing on to the crazy idea that the president of the United States can rape, pillage, and murder anyone he wants to without any recourse whatsoever, including perhaps the Congress of the United States. So that's not going to happen. And so they're just going to let the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals decision stand, which will ultimately be against Donald Trump.
You want to bet about that?
Yeah, I will.
Dinner's on the table.
Dinner's on the table.
Yeah.
Dinner is on the table.
Yeah.
Dinner's, I like that dinner. That's my kind of party. Ray, Renato, and the weird guy in the middle. Robert Ray, thank you very much. Renato Mariotti, appreciate you. Well argued, gentlemen, and thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Pleasure.